Right now, as you watch this, a message is leaving your screen. You probably imagine it going up to a satellite somewhere in space, bouncing back down to whoever you are talking to. Almost none of it does. The truth runs in the opposite direction. It goes down to the coast, into the sea, and across the floor of the ocean, through a cable no thicker than a garden hose, lying in the cold and the dark, thousands of meters below the surface. More than 95% of all the data that moves between continents travels this way. Not through the air, not through space, through glass on the seabed. There are over 1 million kilometers of these cables strung across the planet right now, enough to wrap around the Earth more than 30 times. Every video call to another country, every overseas payment, every search that reaches a server on a different continent, it crosses one of these lines. And here is the strange part. This is not some new technology bolted onto the modern world. We have been laying wires across the bottom of the ocean for more than a century and a half. The internet didn't invent this, it inherited it. So how on earth do you build something like that? The answer begins with a problem almost everyone said could never be solved. So why the ocean floor? Why not satellites? It seems backwards. Space feels modern. A wire on the seabed feels like something out of the past. But physics has a clear opinion. Start with speed. A satellite in geostationary orbit sits about 35,000 kilometers above the Earth. Every signal has to climb all the way up there and fall all the way back down, a round trip of 70,000 kilometers at best. That delay, that lag, is brutal for anything that needs to feel instant. A cable on the ocean floor takes a far shorter path, and a pulse of light racing through glass gets your data there in a fraction of the time. Then there is volume. A single modern cable can carry more data than entire fleets of satellites combined, by an enormous margin. It is not even close. Satellites are wonderful for reaching ships, planes, and remote places with no other option, but for moving the fire hose of the global internet between continents, nothing comes close to a wire. If you find this kind of hidden engineering as fascinating as we do, take a second to subscribe. We tell the real story behind the world's greatest builds. Because this network started long before the internet, with one stubborn man and an ocean nobody had ever crossed with a wire. To understand the wires under the ocean, you have to go back to a world that moved at the speed of a sailing ship. In the 1850s, a message from London to New York traveled the only way it could, on a boat. 10 days, if the weather was kind. A question and its answer could take the better part of a month. Then the telegraph arrived on land, and suddenly cities that were wired together could talk in minutes. But the ocean was a wall. On one side Europe, on the other America. And between them, nothing but water. One man refused to accept that wall. His name was Cyrus Field, an American businessman with no background in science who became obsessed with a single idea: laying a telegraph cable across the entire Atlantic Ocean. Engineers told him the distance was impossible. The seabed was a mystery. No one even knew for certain what lay at the bottom. Field didn't care. He raised the money, gathered the best minds he could find, and in the summer of 1858, 2 warships loaded with cable steamed toward the middle of the Atlantic to attempt something no one had ever done. They would meet in the center, splice their 2 halves together, then sail apart, unspooling a wire across the deep as they went. The 1858 cable worked. For a few glorious weeks, it actually worked. Queen Victoria sent a message of congratulation across the sea, and a journey that once took 10 days now took hours. Crowds celebrated in the streets. Cannons were fired in New York. And then, silence. The cable went dead. The signal had been pushed too hard through fragile copper, and the line was ruined. The dream was over almost as soon as it began. Most men would have walked away. Cyrus Field tried again, and failed again. Then the American Civil War froze everything for years, but he kept raising money, kept learning from every mistake. By the next decade, the engineering had matured. Better cable, better insulation, better instruments. And there was now a ship big enough for the job. The Great Eastern, the largest vessel in the world. A steamship so vast it could swallow the entire cable into its belly. In 1866, that giant crossed the Atlantic, paying out cable the whole way, and reached Newfoundland with the line intact. This time, it held. 2 continents were now joined by a wire that would not die. A message could cross the ocean in minutes, permanently. But remember what was traveling down that wire. Dots and dashes. The real revolution was still 100 years away. For the next 100 years, undersea cables carried electricity. First telegraph signals, then telephone calls, all pushed through copper as electrical pulses. The technology improved, but it was always fighting the same enemy. Electrical signals fade fast over distance, and copper can only carry so many conversations at once. A transatlantic phone cable in the 1950s could handle just a few dozen calls at a time. That was the ceiling. Then came an idea that sounded absurd: stop sending electricity and start sending light. Instead of pushing electrons down a metal wire, you could fire pulses of laser light down a strand of incredibly pure glass, a fiber thinner than a human hair. Light can carry staggering amounts of information, switching on and off billions of times every second. And in the right kind of glass, it can travel astonishing distances before it weakens. The numbers are hard to believe. A single pair of these glass fibers can carry not dozens but millions of simultaneous phone calls. When fiber optics finally reached under the ocean in the late 1980s, capacity didn't just grow, it exploded. But sending a beam of light across an entire ocean creates a brand new problem, one that copper never had to solve in quite the same way. So, what does a modern undersea cable actually look like? Hold one in your hands in the deep ocean, and you might be disappointed. It is about as thick as a garden hose. That's it. This unremarkable-looking line is the backbone of the global internet. But cut it open, and the engineering is extraordinary. At the very center sit the optical fibers, sometimes just a handful of glass strands, each one no wider than a hair, and each capable of carrying an ocean of data. Around them is a layer of steel wire and a tube that holds everything in place. Then a copper conductor, which we will come back to, because it does something vital. Then layers of insulation and waterproofing, and finally a tough outer jacket. In the deep, calm parts of the ocean, that slim hose is all you need. There is nothing down there to harm it. But closer to shore, where ships drop anchor and trawlers drag their nets along the bottom, the cable gets dressed in heavy armor. Thick steel wires wrapped around it, making it as thick as a human arm. The same line, armored where it is in danger, bare where it is safe. And inside that thread, light is doing something that feels almost impossible. How do you fire a beam of light down thousands of kilometers of glass without losing it? The first trick is in the glass itself. The fiber is made so pure and shaped so precisely that light entering one end bounces along the inside, reflecting off the walls again and again without ever escaping. Engineers call it total internal reflection. The light is effectively trapped, racing forward in a zigzag down the core. But even the purest glass isn't perfect. Over distance, the signal slowly fades, growing dimmer and dimmer until it would vanish completely. So every 50 to 100 kilometers along the cable, engineers splice in something remarkable, an optical amplifier. As the weak pulse of light passes through, the amplifier gives it a boost, restoring its strength without ever converting it back into electricity. Across the Atlantic, a single cable might hold 100 of these amplifiers, spaced out along the seabed. And here is where that copper conductor finally earns its place. The amplifiers need power, and there is no plug at the bottom of the ocean. So a high-voltage current, thousands of volts, is fed down the copper from shore, energizing the entire line from end to end. The whole cable is alive, but a powered cable is still useless until someone actually puts it on the seabed. Laying a cable across an ocean is one of the largest and least known engineering operations on the planet, and it begins long before any cable touches the water. First comes the survey. A ship maps the seabed along the planned route in fine detail, charting mountains, canyons, fault lines, and shipwrecks, to find the safest path for a line that has to survive for 25 years. Then comes the cable ship itself, a specialized vessel built for one purpose. Below its deck sit enormous circular tanks, and coiled inside them, by hand, are thousands of kilometers of cable. A single ship can carry the entire length of an ocean crossing in its hull. As the ship sails the route, the cable feeds up from the tanks, over giant grooved wheels and down into the sea behind it, paid out at a steady, careful pace. Near the coast, where the water is shallow and the dangers are real, the ship tows a massive underwater plow. The plow cuts a trench in the seabed, lays the cable into it, and lets the sand fall back over the top, burying the line out of reach of anchors and nets. In shallow water, you bury it. In the deep, you simply let it fall. Out in the open ocean, the challenge changes completely. The average depth the cable must reach is around 3.5 kilometers, deeper than most mountains are tall. In places, it crosses trenches that plunge far deeper still, into a crushing, freezing blackness no human will ever visit. And the cable has to be lowered into all of it, perfectly. This is harder than it sounds. The ship moves forward on the surface, while the cable sinks slowly toward a seabed kilometers below. If too little is paid out, the cable stretches tight and can snap. If too much, it piles up in loops and kinks on the bottom. The crew has to feed it out at exactly the right rate, constantly adjusting for the ship's speed, the depth, and the currents far below. Guiding a thread onto terrain they cannot see. A single mistake can mean hauling kilometers of cable back up to fix it. Day after day, week after week, the ship inches across the ocean, laying its invisible line 1 kilometer at a time. And after thousands of kilometers in the dark, the cable still has to do one more thing. It has to come ashore. The cable comes ashore in the most unremarkable way imaginable. Not at a great port or a gleaming tech campus, but often at a quiet beach, where the buried line slips up out of the sand and runs to a small plain building set back from the water. This is a cable landing station. From the outside it looks like nothing, a low concrete structure that could pass for a warehouse or a pumping station. Most people drive past them without a second thought. Inside, though, the ocean meets the grid. The fibers from the seabed are connected to racks of equipment that take the pulses of light, sort them, and route them onward into the network on land. The cables and data centers that carry the signal the rest of the way to your screen. This quiet building is also where the high-voltage power is fed into the cable to keep those undersea amplifiers alive. A handful of unmarked rooms like this, scattered along the world's coastlines, are where entire continents plug into one another. And the amount of data flowing through these quiet rooms is almost impossible to picture. So how much can one of these cables actually carry? The answer has become almost absurd. A single modern submarine cable can move hundreds of terabits of data every second. Let that sink in. One cable, thinner than a garden hose, carrying the equivalent of millions of high-definition video streams at the very same instant. A cable like Maria, running between the United States and Spain, was tested at well over 200 terabits per second. That is enough capacity to stream tens of millions of videos at once, through one line on the floor of the ocean. And there are hundreds of these cables. Together, the global network of submarine cables carries virtually all of the world's international internet traffic. The calls, the messages, the banking, the streaming, the cloud, the entire digital life of the planet, across a few hundred slim threads of glass. If every satellite in orbit suddenly went dark, the internet would barely notice. If these cables went dark, the modern world would simply stop. Almost no one thinks about them. Almost no one even knows they exist. Which raises an obvious and increasingly urgent question. Who actually owns all of this? The answer has changed dramatically in just the last decade. For most of their history, undersea cables were built by groups of telephone and telecom companies, pooling their money to share the enormous cost. A cable was a shared utility, owned by a consortium of carriers. That world is gone. Today, the biggest names laying cable across the oceans are not telecom companies at all. They are the tech giants: Google, Meta, Amazon, and Microsoft. These companies move so much data between their own data centers and serve so much of the world's internet that it became cheaper to build their own private cables than to rent space on someone else's lines. Google alone has invested in a string of cables spanning every major ocean, some of them owned outright. Together, these few corporations now control a huge and rapidly growing share of all the capacity under the sea. It is a quiet but profound shift. The physical backbone of the global internet, infrastructure once held by national carriers and public utilities, is increasingly private property, owned by a handful of the most powerful companies on the planet. But ownership only matters while the cable is intact. Because all of this depends on something surprisingly fragile, and cables break far more often than you would ever think. Here is something almost no one realizes. Somewhere in the world, an undersea cable is breaking right now. It happens constantly. Across the global network, well over 100 faults occur every single year, roughly 2 or 3 cuts every week. And the most common causes are not dramatic at all. They are ordinary human activity. A ship drops its anchor in the wrong place and drags it across the seabed. A fishing trawler hauls a net along the bottom and snags a line. Together, anchors and fishing account for the majority of all cable breaks. The rest come from the planet itself. Underwater landslides, earthquakes, and powerful currents that can sever a line in an instant. In 2006, a single earthquake off Taiwan broke multiple cables at once and crippled internet and phone service across much of Asia for weeks. When a region has many cables, one break is invisible. Traffic instantly reroutes through the others. But for a place served by only one or two lines, a single cut can knock an entire country offline. So when a cable breaks somewhere out in the deep, someone has to go and find it, on the floor of the ocean. The moment a cable fails, the clock starts. Engineers at the landing stations can pinpoint a break with startling accuracy, measuring how the light reflects back to locate the fault within a few hundred meters, even if it lies thousands of kilometers out to sea. Then a repair ship races to the site. And what happens next looks almost medieval. To reach a cable lying kilometers underwater, the crew lowers a grapnel, a heavy hook on a long line, and drags it slowly across the seabed until it catches the cable. In deep water, they may cut the line first, then haul up each end separately, hooking blindly in the cold and the dark, sometimes for days, fighting the weather the entire time. Once both ends are on deck, technicians splice the delicate fibers back together by hand, fusing strands of glass thinner than a hair with microscopic precision. They test the repair, seal it, and lower the mended cable carefully back down to the bottom. A break that took an instant can take a week or more to fix. There are only a few dozen of these specialized repair ships in the entire world. And increasingly, the breaks they are sent to fix are not accidents. Because these cables are now among the most strategic objects on Earth, and the world has noticed. In recent years, lines have been mysteriously cut in ways that look nothing like accidents. In the Baltic Sea, cables were severed by ships dragging their anchors for miles along the bottom, a pattern investigators found very hard to explain as mere carelessness. Near Taiwan, the cables connecting outlying islands to the mainland network have been cut again and again, leaving residents scrambling to get online. In the Red Sea, one of the world's busiest cable corridors, multiple lines were severed during regional conflict, disrupting traffic between continents. And spying on cables is nothing new. During the Cold War, American submarines secretly tapped a Soviet undersea communications line, recording military traffic for years before the operation was ever discovered. A cable carrying the secrets of nations is an irresistible target to cut or to quietly listen to. Governments are now waking up to a vulnerability hiding in plain sight. A few hundred fragile threads lying largely unguarded on the seabed, carrying nearly everything. The infrastructure the modern world depends on the most is also the infrastructure it can least afford to lose. Think about that, the next time a message crosses the world in an instant. It did not fly through space. It dropped into the sea, raced through a thread of glass on the ocean floor, passed through 100 amplifiers in the crushing dark, and surfaced on another continent, all in a fraction of a second. We have wrapped the entire planet in over 1 million kilometers of these lines. And we started with a single copper wire and a stubborn man who refused to believe an ocean couldn't be crossed. A century and a half later, almost everything we are, our conversations, our money, our knowledge, our entire connected world, runs through a few hundred fragile threads lying silent on the seabed, tended by a handful of ships most people will never see. It is one of the largest things humanity has ever built, and it is almost completely invisible. The greatest network on Earth was built from nothing more than glass, light, and a refusal to accept that the ocean was a wall. If this changed how you see the world beneath the waves, subscribe. There are more impossible builds waiting to be uncovered.